The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 is often narrated as a geopolitical victory, a culmination of the Cold War, where ideological struggle and military pressure brought down the Iron Curtain. Yet this popular narrative entirely misses the true and far more devastating culprit: economics. The Soviet Union did not die on a battlefield, nor was it primarily destroyed by political dissent. It was killed by bankruptcy, a systemic financial failure so profound and absolute that the mighty communist state ran out of hard currency, ran out of credit, and ultimately ran out of food, transforming the world's most powerful military machine into a bankrupt beggar nation in less than 5 years. The fall of the USSR was the ultimate financial failure of the 20th century, a multi-trillion-dollar mistake in central planning that proves command economies are fatally brittle when confronted by the dynamic, brutal forces of the global market. The colossal irony is that a system built on the promise of material prosperity failed entirely to provide basic necessities, sealing its fate not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating sound of an empty treasury and a canceled credit line. The fundamental financial flaw of the Soviet system was its absolute, crippling dependence on oil and gas exports for hard currency income, a weakness that was both disguised and accelerated by the oil crises of the 1970s. When global oil prices skyrocketed, the USSR, sitting atop massive Siberian reserves, suddenly found itself flush with petrodollars, masking the terminal inefficiency of its non-energy sectors. This influx of cash allowed the Kremlin to sustain the immense cost of the arms race, subsidize failing industries, and, crucially, import grain and essential consumer goods that its domestic, collectivized agriculture and planned economy could not produce. For a decade, the Soviet Union essentially ran a gigantic, state-sponsored Ponzi scheme, where military might was purchased with oil money and domestic peace was bought with imported Western butter and jeans. The entire financial stability of the superpower was balanced precariously on a single commodity, creating a fatal vulnerability that its ideological rival, the diversified Western economy, did not possess. This financial structure created an immediate, existential threat the moment the global energy market shifted, a moment often referred to in Moscow as the Black October of Soviet finance. In 1985, Saudi Arabia dramatically increased its oil production, flooding the global market, and oil prices plummeted from over $30 per barrel to below $10 in a matter of months. This sudden, deliberate financial strike, a cooperative action between Western powers and key oil producers, immediately slashed the Soviet Union's hard currency income by an estimated 2/3. The Kremlin's chief financial planners watched in horror as their primary source of foreign capital dried up, creating an instantaneous, non-negotiable budget shortfall equivalent to billions of dollars needed to service their existing foreign debts, sustain their military budget, and, most critically, pay for the imported food that kept the populace from revolting. How was the Soviet Union expected to maintain its military dominance and feed its citizens when 2/3 of its revenue vanished overnight? This financial cliffhanger forced the Soviet leadership into a desperate search for cash, triggering a series of internal and external maneuvers that would lead directly to the collapse. The first casualty of this financial shock was the military-industrial complex, the ideological heart of the Soviet state. The sheer non-negotiable cost of maintaining parity with the US, developing new ICBMs, supporting global client states, and running the colossal war machine was immense, but without the petrodollars, the Soviet government had two impossible choices: cut defense spending and admit military defeat, or maintain the spending and face immediate, catastrophic social collapse due to lack of basic goods. Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of perestroika, economic restructuring, was not an ideological choice. It was a desperate financial triage designed to cut defense costs and seek Western credit to stave off insolvency. He was trying to buy time to convince the West that reform was real enough to warrant massive, life-saving loans. The most profound financial deceit of the Soviet system was revealed not in Moscow statistics, but in the daily life of the Soviet citizen. The state had long maintained an artificial price system, selling bread, housing, and public transport at ludicrously low, subsidized prices, using imported goods and energy revenue to bridge the massive gap between the low selling price and the high cost of production. This system created the paradox of the Soviet Q, a social catastrophe where everyone had money, subsidized wages, but there was nothing to buy, no production. When the oil revenue stopped, the government could no longer afford the subsidies or the imports. The money the average Soviet citizen held, the ruble, was not backed by gold or production. It was backed only by the oil money, which was now gone. The ruble instantly became worthless for anything other than subsidized necessities, driving the real economy into the black market, where Western currency or bartered goods became the only true measure of value. The Soviet citizen suddenly realized that their entire life savings were worthless paper. The financial crisis rapidly accelerated the Chernobyl disaster of 1986, which, while an operational and safety failure, carried an astronomical, unexpected cost that the now bankrupt state could not absorb. The immense financial drain of the cleanup, the loss of agricultural land, and the long-term health costs forced the Kremlin to divert precious, limited resources away from essential industrial modernization and into emergency triage, further paralyzing the already struggling economy. Chernobyl was the single most expensive peacetime disaster the Soviet Union ever faced, and it hit precisely when the petrodollars were gone and the state was already begging for loans. It was the moment the Soviet Union's financial cardiac arrest became public and undeniable, triggering a political and economic domino effect that was impossible to stop. The final, humiliating phase of this collapse was the gold liquidation. Facing the impossibility of paying its maturing debts and needing hard currency for emergency food imports, the Kremlin began secretly selling off its national gold reserves at depressed prices in Western markets, an act of desperate liquidation that fundamentally undermined its perceived financial strength. The very gold that symbolized the nation's supposed wealth and stability was being frantically converted into cash to buy basic food staples. How much gold did the Kremlin have to sell, and what price did they pay just to keep the lights on and the bread shelves stocked? This final desperate sale confirmed what the global markets already knew. The superpower was financially finished. The catastrophic loss of petrodollars and the systemic hemorrhaging of the treasury forced the Kremlin into a series of increasingly humiliating and unsustainable deals with Western financial institutions, marking the official transition from a superpower to a debt client. Gorbachev's desperate plea for Western credit was initially met with caution, but major European banks, particularly those in West Germany, began extending massive, multi-billion-dollar loans to the Soviet state. This external borrowing was not used for productive investment or industrial modernization. It was used almost entirely to cover the state's immediate food import bill and to service existing, high-interest debt that was coming due. The Soviet Union was effectively mortgaging its future, taking out new loans just to pay the interest on the old ones, a classic definition of national insolvency. This dependence created a perverse financial leverage. The West suddenly had a massive financial stake in the stability of the USSR, but also the ultimate tool of control, the power to refuse the next loan and instantly trigger the collapse. The internal financial destruction was most evident in the deliberate suppression of inflation. Unlike Western economies, the Soviet system refused to let its currency reflect the true scarcity of goods. Instead of allowing prices to rise, the state printed more rubles to cover the subsidies, creating a massive monetary overhang, a huge volume of worthless paper currency chasing a tiny supply of actual goods. This hidden inflation meant that while the price of bread might stay the same on paper, the true cost was measured in the hours the Soviet citizen spent standing in a queue trying to find it, or the massive premium they paid on the black market for imported sausage or decent shoes. This policy was a deliberate financial lie, a psychological attempt to maintain the illusion of stability while the true value of the currency evaporated, ensuring that when the system finally fractured, the release of this massive pent-up inflationary pressure would be instantly catastrophic, destroying any remaining social or financial trust. The long term, Non-military cost of the Soviet Empire was another colossal, hidden financial drain that the oil shock made impossible to bear. The USSR maintained a vast network of global client states: Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Bloc nations, and African allies, all of whom required continuous, massive infusions of Soviet aid, subsidized oil, and military equipment, often provided free of charge or in exchange for worthless local currency. This global subsidy program amounted to billions of dollars annually, draining the Soviet treasury of hard currency that was desperately needed at home. When the oil revenue dried up, Gorbachev was forced to make the impossible decision to slowly, then abruptly, cut off this financial life support to the satellite states. This financial abandonment triggered a wave of political instability across the Eastern Bloc, leading directly to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, demonstrating that the Soviet Empire was not held together by ideology or force, but by continuous, unsustainable financial subsidy. The systemic failure of the Soviet five-year plans was exposed by this financial crisis as well. The state planning apparatus, Gosplan, was excellent at directing resources toward massive, symbolic projects like steel mills and space rockets, but hopelessly inefficient at producing the small, high-quality, consumable goods that defined a modern economy. When the oil money was flowing, this inefficiency was hidden by imports. When the imports stopped, the lack of consumer goods became a visceral, undeniable political crisis. The average Soviet worker, who saw their highly subsidized wages buying less and less, began to question the entire system. This led to massive, unprecedented worker strikes in the coal mines and factories, not over political freedom, but over the simple, crushing economic reality that their labor produced nothing of value. The ultimate betrayal was economic. The worker, the supposed hero of the communist state, was the first victim of the system's financial fraud. This raises a crucial question that the Kremlin leadership debated in a state of panic. How much actual gold was left in the Soviet state bank's vault by 1991? The official figures were always propaganda, inflated to maintain international credit. The true figures, only revealed after the collapse, were horrifying and confirmed the scale of the financial crime. The answer reveals the ultimate deceit of the Cold War and the depth of the Soviet financial desperation. The final, frantic attempt to raise cash involved the Soviet Union engaging in a series of highly unfavorable resource bartering deals. Lacking hard currency, they were forced to trade massive amounts of natural gas, timber, and other strategic raw materials with Western companies at depressed prices in exchange for immediate shipments of food and consumer goods. These deals often involved massive long-term commitments, essentially selling off the nation's future natural wealth cheaply to pay for the present crisis. This desperate bartering was the final admission of financial impotence, proving that the Soviet ruble was so untrusted internationally that the state had to revert to a pre-monetary system of exchange, trading physical commodities like a developing nation rather than a financial superpower. The long-term impact of the military-industrial focus was also deeply financial. The best Soviet minds, resources, and materials were always channeled into defense, leaving the civilian sector with outdated technology, poor management, and a massive technological debt that was impossible to repay. The factories that were meant to produce washing machines and tractors were often repurposed to make military components, and the quality control was non-existent. The Soviet citizen was therefore not just deprived of goods, but was surrounded by symbolic, low-quality junk that often broke immediately, fostering a deep cynicism about the entire system. The cost of this systemic neglect, the unmeasured financial cost of low productivity and unusable goods, was far greater than the cost of the missiles themselves, cementing the financial insolvency that ultimately brought the empire to its knees. The financial crisis, therefore, created the political crisis. The empty stores, the worthless ruble, and the constant begging for Western credit eroded the last vestiges of the Soviet state's legitimacy. The public's loss of faith was not ideological. It was transactional. When the state could no longer fulfill its basic economic contract to provide food and stability, the political system became irrelevant. The Kremlin's attempts to salvage the financial system through perestroika and glasnost only accelerated the disintegration, proving that cosmetic political reforms cannot fix a terminally bankrupt economy. Gorbachev's limited introduction of private enterprise, intended to stimulate production, immediately highlighted the fatal structural problems. These new cooperatives and private businesses, starved of raw materials by Gosplan, which prioritized military and state projects, often had to acquire supplies through bribery, black market deals, or by exploiting the price difference between subsidized state goods and free market rates, leading to massive profiteering and corruption. This sudden, uncontrolled shift from a planned economy to a quasi-market economy created a financial free-for-all, where wealth was generated not through productive output, but through arbitrage and the criminal exploitation of the state's price distortions, further eroding public trust and accelerating the flight of capital into the black market. The ultimate humiliation was the answer to the question that haunted the Politburo: how much gold was actually left? The official answer, maintained for years, had suggested thousands of tons. The horrifying truth, revealed by the state bank chairman Viktor Yushchenko and others, was that the Soviet Union's gold reserves had been almost completely liquidated. By early 1991, the reserves were down to a mere 240 tons, a catastrophic figure that was barely enough to cover a few months of food imports. The gold that was supposed to symbolize the superpower's financial strength was gone, having been secretly sold off to finance the arms race, the Afghan war, and the basic consumption of the Soviet people. This revelation, kept secret from the public and most of the Politburo, was the definitive financial death certificate of the USSR, confirming to international creditors and internal factions that the state had no hard assets left to guarantee its massive and rapidly maturing foreign debt. This revelation of financial insolvency immediately triggered the foreign debt crisis of 1991. As the true state of the gold reserves became known to Western intelligence, international banks realized the Soviet debt was largely unsecured. The USSR, which by 1990 owed over $60 billion to Western creditors, a monumental sum for the time, was suddenly refused new lines of credit. The state could no longer borrow to pay its maturing obligations, forcing it into a de facto sovereign default. This loss of credit was the final, irreversible blow. The government could no longer import the grain necessary to feed its cities, nor the machinery parts needed to keep its industries running, leading to an immediate, paralyzing economic contraction and massive social unrest. The great superpower was financially paralyzed by the refusal of a simple loan extension from Western commercial banks. The final financial act of desperation was the attempted transfer of financial power to the republics. As central authority crumbled, the individual Soviet republics, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia, etc., realized that the Moscow Central Bank, Gosbank, was bankrupt and that their locally produced resources were being used to service Moscow's debts. They began to hoard their own gold, oil, and tax revenues, demanding control over their own financial futures and currency. This financial secession was the real driving force behind the political declarations of independence. The republics were not just seeking political freedom. They were attempting to escape the massive, crippling debt burden of the bankrupt central state, leading to a financial fragmentation that made the continuation of the Union utterly impossible. The $60 billion foreign debt became a shared financial bomb that every republic desperately tried to avoid holding. The military was also paralyzed by the financial collapse. The Soviet defense budget, while massive on paper, was increasingly paid in rubles that bought less and less in the black market. The central state could no longer reliably pay its troops, provide adequate housing, or fund the necessary maintenance for its colossal arsenal. This financial degradation of the military led to systemic demoralization, corruption, and a crisis of loyalty. When the August 1991 coup attempt occurred, the military leadership's hesitation was arguably less about ideology and more about the crushing financial reality. They knew that even if they seized power, they were inheriting a financially broken state that could not afford to feed them or the nation. The historical verdict is that the USSR did not have an economic crisis. It was an economic crisis. The entire Soviet experiment was founded on a colossal financial lie, a continuous bet that oil revenues would always be high enough to fund the military-industrial complex and simultaneously subsidize a deeply inefficient consumption system. When the global market, the very force communism rejected, corrected the oil price, the lie was exposed, and the empire, stripped of its gold and credit, went into an irreversible liquidation phase. The tragic financial irony of the Soviet collapse now stands as the ultimate proof that military and ideological power is temporary, but the balance sheet is eternal. The final, devastating chapter of the Soviet financial collapse was the rapid, uncontrolled hyperinflation that immediately followed the dissolution of the Union, a direct consequence of the massive monetary overhang the state had concealed for decades. Once the central authority and the artificial price controls were removed, the billions of worthless rubles that citizens had accumulated over years, the phantom wealth created by state subsidies, suddenly chased the few available goods. Prices skyrocketed by thousands of percent almost overnight, wiping out the entire life savings of the average Soviet citizen, destroying any remaining purchasing power and fulfilling the terrible promise of the black market. This was the moment of maximum economic pain, where the financial lie of the planned economy exploded into a brutal, undeniable reality, ensuring that the transition to a market economy would be characterized by poverty and chaos rather than prosperity. This destruction of savings was the final, irreversible act of financial violence against the populace committed by the state. The ultimate failure of the Soviet system lay not in its inability to produce, but in its inability to price. The entire economic apparatus was fundamentally unable to process information about scarcity, demand, and cost because the prices were dictated by bureaucracy, not by the market. This systemic flaw meant that resources were constantly misallocated. Factories produced goods nobody needed, often to meet arbitrary quotas, while basic necessities like soap, sugar, and meat were perpetually scarce. The lack of a functioning price mechanism was the economic Achilles heel that prevented any genuine reform from succeeding. When Gorbachev attempted to introduce market mechanisms, the distorted, false prices meant that every new enterprise, every foreign investment, and every internal decision was based on criminally inaccurate financial information, guaranteeing that the efforts at perestroika would only hasten the collapse rather than halt it. The historical irony is that the Soviet Union's massive military arsenal, the very instrument of its global power, proved to be its final, toxic financial burden. The cost of decommissioning, securing, and dismantling the colossal inventory of nuclear warheads, tanks, and ICBMs became a massive, unfunded liability that the newly independent states had to shoulder. International powers, particularly the United States, were forced to dedicate significant financial resources to secure and dismantle this toxic military inheritance, a clear sign that the financial collapse of the USSR created a global financial safety hazard. The Soviet military machine, built to defeat capitalism, became a financial black hole that devoured the last of the nation's credit and left a trail of toxic financial and environmental debt. The final financial verdict on the Soviet Union is that it was the greatest case of economic self-sabotage in modern history. The command economy achieved impressive feats of industrial mobilization and military power, but only by cannibalizing its own financial health. It failed to diversify its income beyond oil, failed to manage its debt, and failed to transition from a military economy to a consumer economy. The empire did not fall. It simply ran out of money to operate. The entire system was one colossal, unfunded mandate that worked only as long as the price of oil was artificially high. The moment the global market corrected that price, the Soviet Union's $60 billion foreign debt and its internal monetary overhang became a dual, inescapable wrecking ball. This investigation has proved definitively that the fall of the USSR was a financial assassination carried out not by external armies, but by the relentless, unforgiving mathematics of the global market. The superpower that terrified the world collapsed, not in a blaze of glory, but in the miserable, desperate queues outside empty stores, a victim of its own fatal financial arrogance. The financial details of this story are now fully revealed, but the final judgment rests with you. What do you think? Was the fall of the Soviet Union a failure of communism? Or was it the deliberate financial warfare waged by Western powers through the oil market? Comment below and share your thoughts on the most significant economic implosion of the 20th century.